High in the snowy pine-covered hills of Wisteria Falls, Oregon, a woman in uniform pulled her truck to the side of a frostbitten road, unaware she was seconds away from meeting a ghost from her past. Lying in the snow, barely breathing, was a wounded German shepherd, its eyes fixed on her, not with fear, but something else, something hauntingly familiar. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe in second chances, if you believe that even a broken dog can remember love, then hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear may stay with you longer than you expect. The cold in Wisteria Falls was the kind that settled into bone. It wasn't just temperature, it was memory, it was silence. It was time moving slowly beneath a sky heavy with snow. Nestled in the pine-clad hills of northern Oregon, the small town had long embraced the quiet isolation that came with each long winter. Roads disappeared beneath powdered frost, and the evergreens stood like silent sentinels on either side of the winding pass leading into Wisteria National Forest. Sheriff Emily Carter drove alone that morning, her department-issued SUV crunching slowly over icy gravel. It was early, barely 6:30 a.m., and the sun was a weak smear of gold behind a thick veil of clouds. Snow drifted lightly across her windshield, brushing like ghosts. Inside the cabin, the heater blew softly, but Emily had cracked her window anyway. She needed the sting of cold air against her cheek. It helped anchor her, kept her from drowning in the undertow of the day. She wore her full uniform, dark green with silver trim, the badge pinned over her left chest, the same badge she'd worn for 16 years. Her frame was tall, lean, strong, but more than anything, still. She had the kind of presence that drew attention without asking for it, composed, deliberate, always observing. Her hair, once a vibrant chestnut, had dulled over the years to something closer to bronze. It was tied back in a severe knot beneath her sheriff's hat. Only the faintest creases around her eyes gave hint to the wear time had carved. She didn't speak to the radio. She didn't hum along to the static-filled AM music station. The only sound was the muffled crack of tires on ice and the wind sighing through the evergreens. Today was a day Emily usually refused to work. Every February 3rd for the last 5 years, she had taken personal leave, locked herself in her house, and let the memories take their toll in private. Because 5 years ago, on this day, her 6-year-old son, Tyler, had died, drowned beneath a frozen lake in the neighboring valley while she was on duty. A single call had pulled her away from the picnic, and when she returned, it was too late. Tyler had been the light of her life, and with him gone, that light never returned. Her laughter disappeared first, then her appetite, then her ability to sleep without dreaming of icy water. She hadn't celebrated a birthday or a holiday since. People in town gave her space. They whispered her name softer now. Some called her cold. Others called her strong. But only Emily knew the truth. She hadn't really lived since that day. But this year, she couldn't disappear. The department was short-staffed, and her absence would leave a gap someone else would have to cover. So, she agreed to take the northern route, the quietest, most remote patrol circuit. No tourists this time of year, just deer, snow, and trees too tall to fall. As she steered through the narrowing pass near Cold Creek, Emily's gaze flicked across the tree line. A fog bank was settling in low, hugging the frozen ground, curling like smoke around the roots of fir trees. Her mind wandered. She tried not to let it, but every tree reminded her of the woods behind her old backyard. Every frozen patch of ground could have been the lake. And then she saw it. At first it was no more than a shadow, barely distinguishable from the brush and frost. But as her eyes adjusted and the SUV crept forward, the shape became clearer moving, though just barely. A dog. It stumbled from the tree line, its frame gaunt, each step dragging like its legs had forgotten how to carry it. Snow clung to its matted fur, and a dark streak trailed from its hind leg. Its coat, once thick and noble, was a patchwork of ice and dust, and the color. Yes, unmistakably a German shepherd, though nearly lost under grime. Emily braked slowly, pulling the vehicle to the shoulder. Her fingers hovered over the door handle, breath catching in her throat. The dog hadn't seen her yet, or maybe it had and didn't care. It kept moving forward, dragging itself toward the road, with a strange kind of purpose, like it wasn't just fleeing something, but searching. Then it paused, its head lifted slightly, one ear twitching. Eyes not wild, but Warren locked onto the vehicle. And then, slowly, it began to limp directly toward her. Emily stared, frozen. Not by the cold, but by something else. Something old, familiar, something she couldn't yet name. Emily stepped out of the SUV slowly, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots. The cold rushed into her collar, but she barely noticed. Her breath plumed in front of her as she approached the dog now hunched in the middle of the road, its sides rising and falling with the shallow rhythm of exhaustion. She crouched, hand out, palm facing down, every movement deliberate. Her badge glinted faintly in the filtered gray light. The dog didn't growl. It didn't retreat. It simply watched her, its eyes dulled by hunger and pain, but calm. She inched closer and finally reached the animal. From this distance, she could see it more clearly. Male, full-grown German shepherd, though gaunt to the point of skeletal. His coat, once likely a mix of sable and black, was now tangled, dusted with frost and clinging burrs. One of his hind legs was tucked awkwardly beneath him, the fur around the joint darkened with dried blood. Emily's gloved hand touched the matted fur gently. No flinch, no tension, just quiet surrender. And then she saw it. A strip of torn leather around his neck. A collar. She leaned in, brushing ice and grime away with her fingertips. The brass tag was scuffed beyond recognition at first, but when she tilted it toward the weak morning light, a faint word caught her breath. Ranger. The world blurred for a second. She blinked hard. There was no doubt. The name had burned itself into her heart years ago. Ranger. Her chest tightened as if a rope had been yanked around her ribs. Memories crashed into her, the smell of antiseptic and puppy breath, the small frame curled up against her son's chest. The way Tyler had giggled when Ranger licked his nose. The sound of that laugh now came back like wind through broken glass. It had been 5 years since the drug bust in the timberlands north of Wisteria. They had found the camp abandoned, scattered with needles, gas cans, and in one corner of a rotting shack 3 barely alive puppies in a wire cage. Emily had taken one home for the night, intending only to drop it off at the shelter the next day. But Tyler had fallen in love with the scrappy German shepherd, named him Ranger, told her he was a superhero in disguise. She couldn't say no. For 6 months, Ranger had lived with them, growing fast, clever, alert, always glued to Tyler's side. Then came the offer from the county K-9 unit. Ranger had scored nearly perfect in temperament and obedience evaluations. Emily had convinced herself it was the right thing. Tyler had cried, but finally agreed. If they could visit Ranger after training, they never got the chance. Tyler died 3 weeks later, and Ranger transferred out of county. She never saw him again. Until now. Emily lifted the dog into her arms slowly, carefully. He was heavier than she expected, 35, maybe 40 pounds, but limp, all trust. She wrapped him in the wool blanket from the back seat, her jaw clenched tight to hold back the emotions pressing against her ribs like a tidal wave. As she placed him gently on the back seat of her vehicle, her gaze flicked up to the dashboard. There, half buried under papers and old report folders, was a photo she hadn't moved in years. Emily reached for it. It was creased, its corners soft from handling. In it, Tyler sat cross-legged in their backyard, his arms around a fuzzy Ranger who still had puppy ears too big for his head. Both were smiling like the world was made just for them. She stared at it now, her eyes stinging. "Is that why you came back?" she whispered. The dog stirred slightly, not quite conscious, but not entirely gone either. His ear twitched at her voice. Emily placed the photo gently on the seat beside him, then climbed into the driver's side and turned the ignition. She drove in silence, not just the silence of snow and pine and empty road, but the internal kind, the kind that had lived inside her like a locked room ever since that afternoon at the lake. But today, something cracked, not open, not yet, but cracked. Emily kept glancing into the rearview mirror as she drove, her eyes never straying long from the battered form curled in the back seat. Ranger lay bundled in the thick wool blanket, barely moving, his breath shallow but steady. His body shifted slightly with the motion of the car, and every so often a soft sound, half whimper, half breath escaped his muzzle. The snow had thinned to a light dust, and the roads through Wisteria Falls were quiet, glazed in frost. The town, still waking, glowed faintly under the white sky, the tips of trees gilded by pale winter light. The veterinary clinic stood at the edge of Main Street, a low wood-paneled building with a sagging awning and a sign that read, Wisteria Animal Health and Rescue, in weathered green paint. A blue ceramic dog statue stood by the door, its nose chipped from seasons of hail and ice. Emily pulled up to the front, left the engine running, and got out. She opened the back door and gently gathered Ranger into her arms again. He groaned softly, but didn't resist. Inside, the warm air hit her like a wall infused with the scent of antiseptic, fur, and faint traces of cedar wood from the pine-scented cleaner the clinic used. The waiting room was small, lined with mismatched chairs and a low coffee table stacked with old magazines. The reception desk was unattended. Emily had barely stepped inside when a voice called from the hallway. "Be right with you." A moment later, a man appeared from the back room. He was in his mid-40s, tall, lean, with umber-toned skin and thoughtful, deep-set eyes framed by laugh lines that hadn't seen much laughter in recent years. His dark curly hair was beginning to silver at the temples. He wore a navy scrub top under a faded fleece vest, a pen tucked behind his ear, and a tired calmness that felt practiced, like a man who had long ago learned how to breathe steadily through storm after storm. "Malik?" Emily asked, her voice soft but firm. "That's me," he said, stepping forward. "And you're Sheriff Carter. I've seen you around." His eyes moved to the bundle in her arms, and his expression changed immediately, his professional mask rising, concern flashing beneath. "Let's get him inside." They moved into the exam room. Malik held the door open as Emily placed Ranger gently on the padded table. He began unwrapping the blanket carefully, his gloved fingers moving with quiet expertise. As the fur and cloth parted, the full extent of the dog's condition was revealed. Malik paused. "Damn," he murmured under his breath. One hind leg was swollen, punctured with deep bite marks along the haunch, crusted over with blood. There was an open gash near the shoulder clean, but long, like a tear from claws or sharp rocks. Ribs jutted out beneath matted fur, and a trail of bruises ran along the side. "This dog's been through hell," Malik said, his voice low. "Predator attack, maybe a coyote or something bigger, and judging by the infection, he's been walking on this leg for days, if not longer." Emily stood silently by the door, arms folded tightly across her chest, her jaw clenched. "His name is Ranger," she said. "He used to be mine." Malik glanced up, something shifting behind his calm exterior. "Used to be? I found him during a bust 5 years ago. He lived with me and my son for a while before going into K-9 training. We lost track of him after that." Malik gave a soft nod, not prying. He returned his attention to Ranger, starting to clean the wounds. As he worked, his movement steady and precise, he spoke in a tone that was both clinical and comforting. "He's lucky you found him when you did. That leg's infected. I'll start fluids, antibiotics, pain meds. Then we'll x-ray to check for breaks." Emily gave a small nod but said nothing. Her eyes didn't leave Ranger. For a while, neither spoke. It was Malik who broke the silence. "My wife died out there," he said suddenly, without looking up. Emily blinked. "I'm sorry?" "In the forest, 3 years ago. Hiking accident. A rock slide." His voice was quiet but clear. "She was a biologist. Loved the wild more than cities. I tried to bring her back, but—" He trailed off, finishing the bandage on Ranger's leg. Emily didn't know what to say. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind born between two people who knew what it meant to lose someone and survive afterward. Not fully healed, just still standing. "I'm sorry," she said finally, meaning it. Malik offered a small nod. "I don't say it for sympathy, just, I know what grief looks like." Emily looked down, her hands tightening slightly. "He came back today," she said. "Today would have been my son's 11th birthday." Malik looked up again, and this time his gaze met hers and held it. They stood there, two people with different lives, different scars, but somehow, in that moment, the same kind of weight rested on their shoulders. Ranger let out a soft whine, stirring slightly. "He's stable," Malik said. "Let me monitor him for a few hours. If you'd like, you can wait out front. There's coffee, bad coffee, but it's hot." Emily gave a faint smile, the first hint of one in years. "I'll stay," she said, pulling a chair up beside the table. Malik gave her a quiet nod, then left the room without another word. As Emily sat beside the wounded dog, watching his chest rise and fall, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the photo again. She placed it gently on the table next to Ranger's head. "You came back," she whispered. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the eaves. But inside the clinic, for the first time in a long time, Emily Carter felt the faint warmth of something thawing. The snow had stopped by morning. Sunlight filtered weakly through gray clouds, casting a pale shimmer across the icy rooftops of Wisteria Falls. At the small veterinary clinic on the edge of town, the world seemed to move slower, deliberate, softened by silence. Inside the recovery room, Emily Carter sat in a plastic chair beside a padded table, a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee untouched in her hand. Her uniform jacket hung over the back of the chair, and for the first time in years, she looked still. Ranger lay asleep beside her, breathing shallow but rhythmic. His rear leg, now wrapped in clean white bandages, was propped up gently. A soft IV line trailed from his foreleg to a stand behind him. His eyes fluttered now and then, but he didn't stir. Malik entered quietly, clipboard in hand. "Vitals are holding steady," he said with a small smile. "He's tough. Most dogs wouldn't have made it this far on their own." Emily looked up at him. Her face, usually unreadable, had softened since the night before. There was no smile, but there was no wall either. He always was. Malik walked over and gently adjusted the flow of fluids. "I think he'll pull through, but recovery's going to take time, weeks, maybe months." "I want to take him home," Emily said, her voice steady. Malik raised an eyebrow slightly, not surprised but cautious. "Are you sure? He'll need dressing changes, meds twice a day, limited movement at first. That's not a small commitment." "I know," she paused. "But he came back to me. I'm not letting him go again." There was a pause. Malik gave a small nod. "I'll prep the discharge forms and pack what he needs, but I want to check him again in 3 days. Deal?" "Deal." Later that afternoon, Emily carried Ranger gently into her truck again, cradled in the same wool blanket. The drive back through town was quiet, just like before, but something in her chest felt different. Not light, not healed, but no longer hollow. The old creaks of her wooden house greeted her like forgotten friends as she opened the front door and stepped inside. The air was cool and still. Ranger's old bed, kept in the attic all these years, untouched, had been brought down that morning and placed beside the fireplace. She laid him there carefully, adjusting the blanket around him. He stirred, eyes opening for a moment, then closed again with a soft exhale. That night, after tending to Ranger's meds and dinner, a warm broth laced with crushed antibiotics, Emily sat at her kitchen table. The yellow light above hummed faintly. A lined leather journal lay open in front of her, a pen in her hand. She stared at the blank page for a long while, and then, for the first time in half a decade, she began to write. February 5th. "I think he's really back. Not just physically, but something more. Maybe the part of me I lost with him is coming back too. I don't know what to make of it. But for the first time in years, I want to try." She didn't stop after one entry. The next night, and the one after, the journal became a companion. Her words were hesitant at first, clumsy and stilted, but soon they flowed memories of Tyler, guilt that had never softened, moments of happiness she had locked away and refused to touch. Each page became a confession, and in the telling, a form of release. Ranger, though slowed by pain and healing bones, followed her wherever she went. When she moved from room to room, he lifted himself with effort, limped after her, and curled by her feet. He slept beside her bed at night, guarding the door like he had when he was young, like Tyler was still asleep in the next room. Emily would wake sometimes to find him watching her, head resting on his paws, eyes calm. She spoke to him often now, not like to a pet, but to someone who listened. And in those conversations, one-sided though they were, her voice slowly lost its rust. One evening, 3 weeks after Ranger's surgery, Emily stood at the back door of her home, mug in hand. The yard was still covered in snow, though patches of dead grass had begun to peek through where the sun had worked its quiet thaw. Ranger stood beside her, stiff but upright, his tail gently thudding against her shin. She looked down at him, and then, without really planning to, she whispered, "You saved me too, didn't you?" Ranger looked up, and for a second she saw something familiar, something unspoken but understood. That night, she wrote in the journal again. He doesn't need to chase criminals or wear a badge anymore. He just needs to stay. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. It began with a sound, a single distant wail, sharp and metallic, rising through the forest canopy, like the cry of a ghost. Emily Carter had just set her coffee mug down on the windowsill when she heard it. The wind was steady that morning, cutting across the backyard in low, bitter gusts. But this sound wasn't from nature. It was man-made. A warning. Somewhere far up the mountain ridge, one of the old fire sirens had been tripped. The problem was, those sirens hadn't been in use for years. Before she could reach for her radio, she heard Ranger growl. Not the lazy grumble of discomfort that had become common during his recovery, but a sharp, alert snarl. He had risen to his feet, slow but determined, and now stood at the back door, his ears perked high and tail stiff. When the siren cut through the air again, this time lower, almost like an echo, Ranger let out a short, high-pitched bark and began pacing in frantic circles. Emily's instincts, long dulled by grief but never fully gone, kicked in. She watched the dog for a moment. His movements weren't random. He wasn't afraid. He was trying to tell her something. She bent down, placed a hand on his chest to still him, and locked eyes with him. "What is it, boy?" he whined, turning back toward the window. By noon, Emily had loaded Ranger into the SUV reluctantly, given his state, and drove west toward Ridgeway Trail, a rugged logging path that looped into the old forest reserve. Most of the area had been abandoned by rangers and patrol units over a decade ago, after a landslide damaged the main access road. But Emily knew the back ways. And more importantly, she knew that siren wasn't just for fire. It had once been used to signal intruder alerts from a chain of private cabins built illegally during the logging boom, many of which had since been seized and left to rot. She reached out to Malik before setting out, partly for company, partly because she needed someone who understood field chemicals. He arrived 20 minutes later, wearing a thick down jacket, backpack slung over one shoulder, hiking boots dusted in snow. He looked out of place against the wilderness, backdrop too calm, too precise. But there was something in his posture, in the way he moved with quiet purpose, that made him blend into even the wildest spaces. "Didn't expect a field trip," he said lightly as he climbed into the passenger seat. "Blame him," Emily replied, nodding toward the back seat, where Ranger lay curled up, alert but quiet. They drove in silence for most of the way, the vehicle rocking on uneven ground as they moved deeper into the forest. The snow grew thicker with elevation, undisturbed by human traffic. Every so often, Ranger would lift his head, ears twitching. At one turn near the North Loop, he barked once, sharply. Emily slowed. They parked beneath a canopy of bare oaks and dense firs. The air was dense with silence, no bird song, no wind, just stillness. Ranger stepped out slowly, testing the ground before committing his weight. Emily clipped a soft lead to his collar and let him take the lead. He limped, but purposefully. 20 yards in, they found the remnants of an old logging road, partially buried in snow. Tracks recent, light had disturbed the surface. Not animal, not tire, boots. Emily motioned Malik to follow, hand near the holster on her belt. They walked another 50 feet before the trees opened slightly, revealing the shell of a cabin tucked against a rock wall. The roof sagged under snow, and most of the windows had been boarded up. Ranger growled low in his throat, body leaning slightly forward. Emily raised a hand and approached the door. It wasn't locked. Inside, the smell hit first chemicals. Sharp, pungent, mixed with rotting wood and mildew. Empty metal drums were stacked in one corner, with residue dried at the rims. Nearby, black plastic tubs, sealed but warped by cold. A row of broken shelves lined the back wall, each holding empty cartons labeled with obscure serial codes. Malik entered behind her, pulling a mask over his face instinctively. "This isn't just old paint thinner," he muttered. "This is acetone, ether, probably ammonia nitrate derivatives too. Someone was mixing something volatile here, very recently." Emily's brow furrowed. "Drug lab? Could be, or explosives. Either way, it's not abandoned, not completely." They searched in silence for another 15 minutes, collecting samples with gloves and baggies. Ranger stayed at the door, alert, as if expecting someone or something to return. "I thought this place was cleared years ago," Malik said. "Wasn't there a raid up here back in 2017? Emily nodded. "We swept most of these cabins, but this one wasn't mapped. Could have been built after or hidden from aerial scans." They left just as the clouds began to thicken again, sky dimming with the approach of evening. Back in the SUV, Emily leaned her head against the wheel for a moment, processing. Ranger lay behind them, his eyes closed but tail gently tapping against the seat. Malik glanced sideways. "Do you think he remembered this place?" "I don't know," Emily said, "but I think he came back for a reason." There was a long silence, filled only by the hum of tires over frozen dirt. "You trust him," Malik said quietly. "I always did," she replied. Outside, the forest fell away behind them. The snow began to fall again, soft and soundless, erasing their tracks with quiet precision. Emily sat at her kitchen table the next morning, Ranger dozing at her feet. The coffee in her mug had long gone cold, forgotten, as she stared at the old collar she'd retrieved from the evidence bag on her desk. It was cracked, the brass tag dulled with time and weather, but embedded in the inner lining was something unexpected. An aging GPS module no bigger than a button battery. It had been embedded there for tracking during Ranger's K-9 training. Somehow, it had survived, and maybe, just maybe, it still held data. She called in a favor from a former colleague, Deputy Ben Navarro, a tech-savvy, affable man in his early 30s who now worked admin for County Dispatch. Ben had a disheveled look about him, loose curly hair, always in need of a trim, wireframe glasses perpetually slipping down his nose, but his mind was sharp and always 3 steps ahead. He was known in the department as the guy who could hack a toaster if it had a port. Ben met her at the sheriff's station an hour later, wheeling in a weathered laptop with a data converter cable already dangling from the side. "This thing looks prehistoric," he said, examining the GPS unit, "but it might still hold something. Depends on whether the chip corroded." "It's all I've got," Emily replied. It took nearly 30 minutes, but then, on the grainy screen, a series of coordinates began to flash. Some were old, dating back years. But the last recorded location was different. 70 miles southeast, in a remote mountain basin called Eagle's Draw. Emily recognized the name immediately. It was the site of a now-closed investigation, a black market animal trafficking ring that had operated deep in the mountains under the guise of a private hunting preserve. She remembered the operation clearly. They'd raided it 5 years ago, arrested 6 people, and freed over 30 exotic animals. The case had been wrapped up quickly, too quickly. "This is where he came from," she murmured, pointing at the most recent pings. "Not where he ended up, where he started." Ben leaned closer. Could be someone took him back there after he left the K-9 program, but why? She didn't answer. The knot in her stomach had begun to tighten. 2 days later, Emily and Ranger, now stronger, though still moving with care, set off toward Eagle's Draw. She brought Malik again, at his own insistence, though this time he seemed more prepared. He wore a heavier parka, brought trail gear, and even packed supplies for Ranger. "This isn't just curiosity," he said quietly as they crossed into the timberland. "You think this is personal?" Emily nodded. "It is." They hiked the final mile on foot. The trail had long been overgrown, and the map Emily had was outdated, but Ranger seemed to know the way. He stopped often, sniffing brush, alert to changes in scent. The air was colder here, heavy with altitude and silence. When they reached the basin, it was clear the location hadn't been abandoned as completely as the report had claimed. Wooden fencing still stood in parts, bent but not collapsed. A large barn-like structure sagged to one side but bore fresh boot prints in the snow, leading to its side door. Emily motioned for quiet. Inside the building, rows of rusted cages sat empty. Along the far wall were boxes sealed, labeled with false shipping addresses. Malik knelt by one and opened it. "Medical kits," he muttered. "Sedatives, tagging gear. Someone's been preparing for something." Emily walked toward a rusted file cabinet, forced it open. Inside were torn pages from a ledger, names, species, locations, and something that made her blood run cold. Dates, all recent. "It's not over," she whispered. Ranger growled, ears suddenly raised. He stood by a narrow hallway leading into a rear office, his body tense. Emily drew her weapon, nodded to Malik to stay behind. She crept forward slowly, each step echoing off the wooden walls. When she reached the doorway, she found nothing but more papers maps, detailed sketches of shipping routes, drop points, and satellite images marked with red circles. This was no accident. Someone had reactivated the ring, and, Ranger. Ranger had escaped it. Later, back at the SUV, Emily sat in silence as Ranger rested beside her in the back. Malik drove this time, the road winding back down through pine and snow. Emily stared out the window, mind racing but oddly clear. "He didn't just survive," she said aloud. "He came back to show me." Malik glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Ranger's eyes blink open slowly. "He remembered everything," she added. "And somehow, he found a way to lead me back to the start." The snow began just after noon, fine and feather-light at first, floating like dust through the evergreens above Eagle's Draw. By the time Emily and Malik reached the base of the eastern slope, it had thickened to a curtain of white, swirling and relentless. The trail they had followed earlier had already vanished behind them, swallowed by snowfall that erased not just tracks, but time. Emily adjusted the strap of her rifle across her chest, her breath forming sharp plumes in the frozen air. Malik walked beside her, his shoulders hunched beneath the weight of a heavy pack and the knowledge of what they were walking into. He wasn't a fighter, not by training, but there was a quiet strength in his steps, a refusal to look away. Ranger led them slowly but with conviction, his gait uneven but purposeful. The bandages on his rear leg were now reinforced with waterproof wraps, and though he limped, he never hesitated. Every few yards he would pause, nose lifted to the air, then adjust direction as if following a scent the wind itself couldn't carry. They were nearly 2 hours into the forest when the terrain began to change. Rockier, with thick patches of thorn brush rising through the snow. Emily held up a hand and crouched, her eyes scanning the narrow ridge ahead. A faint shimmer of disturbed snow suggested recent movement. Ranger let out a quiet growl. "We're close," she whispered. The three of them moved forward in near silence. The trees thinned, revealing a clearing bordered by jagged stone. At the far end, nearly invisible beneath a sloped rise and the camouflage of snow and rock, was a heavy steel hatch, a bunker. Emily motioned to Malik to stay low. She approached slowly, footsteps silent. Ranger flanked her, ears forward, body tense. The hatch was locked, but not sealed. It had been opened recently, the snow around it brushed away by boots. No tracks led out. "They're inside," Emily said. Suddenly a noise cracked through the air, a sharp metallic slam, followed by a muffled shout from within. Emily raised her weapon. Malik reached into his coat and pulled out a small flashlight, keeping it low. Then came the sound they weren't prepared for. A gunshot. Before she could react, Ranger moved. The world became a blur. Snow exploded upward, a flash of motion. Then a second gunshot tore the silence. Emily dropped to one knee, weapon drawn, scanning the trees. Too late to see where it came from. And then she felt the weight. Ranger had thrown himself into her side, knocking her flat just as the shot landed. The bullet struck the ground where she'd stood a second earlier. Ranger didn't cry out, but his body shuddered against hers. "Ranger!" she screamed. Blood bloomed across the fur of his side, dark and rapid against the white snow. But he stayed upright, baring his teeth, eyes locked toward the tree line. A figure emerged, a man, tall and narrow-shouldered, wrapped in a green parka and ski mask, rifle raised. Emily didn't hesitate. She fired once, striking low, into the thigh. The man crumpled with a howl, dropping his weapon and disappearing into the snow. Malik rushed to Ranger's side, hands already pressing cloth to the wound. "Through and through," he said breathlessly. "No shattered bone, but he's losing blood." Emily's face was ice calm, but burning underneath. More voices echoed from within the bunker now. Footsteps. Panic. Malik looked up, fear creeping in. "There could be more." Emily nodded. "Then we finish it." She radioed for backup, gave coordinates and a full report, her voice like steel through the static. Then she moved toward the bunker, kicking the hatch open with one boot. Inside, the space was dimly lit and foul with chemical residue. Two men scrambled at the far end, trying to destroy documents, stomp out evidence. One of them reached for a sidearm, but Emily had already crossed the threshold. "Sheriff Carter," she said, "hands where I can see them." They froze. 10 minutes later, it was over. The remaining men were restrained with zip ties, evidence tagged, and Ranger, his wound cleaned and tightly wrapped, was carried out in Malik's arms. Outside, the blizzard had turned violent, wind slamming against the trees like a living force. But Emily stood still, blood and snow on her uniform, her rifle slung across her back. Ranger rested in her arms now, his head nestled into her chest, breathing shallow but steady. Malik stood beside her, quiet, watchful. "You okay?" he asked. "No," she said. Then, after a moment, "But I'm here." And that was enough. For the first time in years, she had not frozen in the face of fear. She had not let loss dictate her actions. In the moment Ranger threw himself into danger for her, she had remembered what it felt like to fight for something that mattered. And she had not failed. The storm had passed by morning, leaving Wisteria Falls under a sheet of pale winter light. Snow blanketed the rooftops and forest paths in silence, but it was a silence no longer heavy. It felt clean, like a page turned, like breath drawn after holding it too long. For the first time in years, Sheriff Emily Carter didn't feel like a figure moving through fog. She felt present, awake, grounded. The criminal ring had collapsed in the days that followed. With the evidence recovered from the underground bunker and the confessions of the 2 detained men, law enforcement from 3 counties were able to track down the remaining members of the trafficking network. It made headlines: illegal animal trade operation dismantled after break in cold case. But in Wisteria Falls, no one talked about the case. They talked about the dog. Ranger's story spread across town long before any newspaper picked it up. How he'd returned from the wild after years away, wounded but determined, and led Emily, his former handler and lost friend, back into the woods to finish what had been left undone. Children whispered about him like he was a legend. Elderly neighbors left treats on Emily's porch addressed to the bravest good boy. And in the center of it all, Ranger simply lay in the sun, one hind leg bandaged, ears flicking lazily at flies, with no understanding that he had become a symbol of something much bigger than himself. He didn't return to his old strength. The wound had healed, but not cleanly. His back leg would always limp, his stride permanently uneven. He could no longer chase or leap or run the forest the way he once had. But that didn't matter to Emily. She had made a choice. Ranger stayed. She adopted him officially 3 weeks after the final arrests. No ceremony, no speech, just paperwork, a new engraved collar, and a quiet promise between old friends. His new tag read, "Ranger Home." But Emily wasn't done. The fire that had been reignited in her during the investigation hadn't faded with the snow. For years, she had moved like a shadow of herself, going through the motions of service without direction. But now, with Ranger always close, she saw a new path, one that wasn't about chasing danger or locking up criminals, but about preparing others to respond before danger struck. That spring, she filed a proposal with the county to open a regional K-9 search and rescue training center right on the edge of Wisteria Falls. It would partner with law enforcement, first responders, and local volunteers, offering training for both dogs and handlers in mountain search, disaster recovery, and trauma therapy. And at the center of the initiative, Ranger. He would never track again, but he could walk the grounds, interact with new dogs, provide stability during stressful sessions. And more than that, his story, his loyalty, his resilience became the first thing new trainees learned on day one. He was no longer a weapon or a tool. He was a teacher. As plans for the center were finalized, Emily spent her evenings writing. The idea came to her unexpectedly one night, while brushing snow from Ranger's coat. His eyes had caught hers, full of that quiet wisdom dogs carry, and she thought, not for the first time, "You remembered me. You remembered love." The words stayed with her, grew. She titled the essay, "The Dog Who Remembered Love." It wasn't meant to be published at first. It was more confession than article, part testimony, part eulogy for the woman she used to be, part love letter to the dog who brought her back from the edge. But Malik, ever thoughtful, read the first draft one rainy Sunday evening at her kitchen table, and when he looked up, his voice was steady. "This should be read," he said, "not just by handlers, by people." So she sent it to a regional publication, then a national one. And then, to her quiet surprise, it went viral, shared thousands of times, translated into 5 languages. Ranger's face, gray-muzzled and proud, appeared in magazines and online journals under headlines like, "This K-9 didn't just save lives, he healed a human heart." Emily didn't chase the attention. She didn't want fame. But with every email that arrived from someone saying, "Your story helped me mourn," or "I adopted a rescue dog after reading this," She began to understand what healing really meant. It wasn't forgetting. It wasn't fixing. It was choosing to stay open, even after everything. As for Malik, he stayed too. They never defined what they were, not in words, but their lives began to weave together in quiet ways. He moved closer to the center, volunteered during off hours, and joined her and Ranger on long walks through the old trails. He still carried the memory of his wife like a stone in his pocket, smooth from handling, never gone. But he smiled more now, laughed even. And on one crisp morning in June, he showed up with a hand-carved wooden sign for the new center gate. It read, Ranger's Haven, Search and Rescue, Healing and Hope. By summer's end, the center opened its doors. The first team graduated in August, and the first dog rescued a missing hiker less than a month later. Emily stood at the edge of the field that day, Ranger lying at her feet. The mountains rolled out beyond them, green and endless under the Oregon sun. She reached down, ran her hand through the fur behind his ears. "You stayed," she said. And Ranger, as always, simply looked up, tail wagging once, slow and sure. We don't choose where our story begins, but we can choose who walks beside us as it continues. Ranger wasn't just a dog who came home. He was a memory that refused to fade, a quiet spark that reignited a life once frozen by grief. He reminded a woman who had lost everything that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing love again, even when it hurts. In a world that moves too fast, where wounds are often hidden and pain goes unspoken, Ranger's return was more than a rescue. It was a return to hope, a second chance, a whisper that said, "You are not alone." Maybe there's a Ranger in your life too. Maybe not a dog, but a friend, a memory, a moment that leads you back to something you thought you lost. If this story touched your heart, share it. Leave a comment and tell us who reminded you to keep going. Subscribe for more stories of love, loyalty, and the miracles hidden in everyday lives. And may God bless you, especially if you're hurting, especially if you've forgotten how to begin again. Because somewhere out there, someone or something is still waiting to walk beside you.